There is a moment, quiet, piercing, irreversible, when a person stops hoping the world will understand them. It's not dramatic. There's no audience, no applause, just silence. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize no one is coming to fix it. No one is staying up at night thinking about your pain. And in that silence, something ancient wakes up. A kind of strength that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, and doesn't need to be seen. That's the moment you stop performing and start becoming. Because the world may be indifferent, but you don't have to be powerless. The Stoics understood this long before us. They believed power begins when expectations die, and in that death, your real life begins. If you're someone who's ready to stop chasing validation and start cultivating inner power, consider subscribing as a quiet vow to yourself, a step toward a life rooted in discipline, clarity, and self-respect. Because here, we don't chase the world's applause. We build what the world can't ignore. Most people carry a quiet fantasy that their suffering is visible, that if they just hurt enough, someone will step in, that maybe if they just word it right, someone will understand. It's a soft hope, often unspoken, built deep into the way we're raised. If I'm in pain, the world will care. But then life happens. Pain is ignored. Tears go unnoticed. The phone stays silent. And that's when something shifts. You begin to see the illusion for what it really is. Not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of how consumed people are by their own chaos. Everyone is battling something you'll never fully see, just like they'll never fully see yours. And if you build your identity on being seen, you will spend your life feeling invisible. That quiet ache of being overlooked, that's not cruelty, that's reality. And if you look closely, it might be trying to teach you something important. When we're young, we believe that pain deserves recognition. We think that if we suffer, someone owes us comfort. But the truth is, life doesn't hand out medals for endurance. It doesn't send angels when you're on your knees. It just moves on. People go about their lives. Friends forget. Strangers scroll. Not out of malice, but because they're drowning in their own problems. That might sound harsh, but harsh doesn't mean untrue. And here's the strange twist. That realization, painful as it is the first step toward becoming free. Because once you stop expecting the world to respond to your pain, you stop waiting. You stop freezing your life in hopes that someone will notice you're stuck. You begin to move for reasons that have nothing to do with applause. Carl Jung once said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you." But what he didn't say, what you learn through experience, is that most people don't ask because they care. They ask so they can fit you into a box that makes sense to them. They don't see you. They see their idea of you. And when you stop performing for that gaze, you finally start living for something real. There's a kind of sorrow that comes with realizing you're not the main character in anyone's story, but your own. It's not rejection. It's simply gravity. No one owes you understanding. No one is required to hold your hand through the fog. And while that can make the world feel colder, it also makes your inner world burn brighter, because now you're the one lighting the fire. No more waiting for someone to read between the lines of your silence. No more hoping that your quiet breakdown will be noticed and gently mended by someone who just happens to get it. You get it now, and that changes everything. That disappointment, the one that used to sting, becomes something else. It becomes clarity, and clarity is the first real freedom. This is where the Stoics found their strength, not in being untouched by pain, but in refusing to outsource their healing. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about your neighbors." In other words, Stop hoping someone else will see your wounds and name your value. The more you focus on being seen, the less you see yourself. And ironically, the more invisible you become. You become noise in someone else's life, rather than signal in your own. But when you finally let go of the hope that others will witness your suffering and give it weight, that's when you begin to build something indestructible. Not because you're harder, but because you're clearer. You start noticing how much of your identity was shaped around being seen, around the belief that someone, somewhere, should care. And when they didn't, you took it personally. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Just because people don't care doesn't mean you're unworthy. It just means they're human, flawed, overwhelmed, distracted, just like you. The game was never about being seen. It was about waking up to the fact that you were always watching. You've been the one living inside your mind this whole time. You've been the only witness to the full weight of your thoughts. That's not a curse. That's a gift. Because it means you are the one with the power to change your narrative. Not them, you. There's power in being unseen. There's clarity in walking without needing an audience. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And that's what happens when you stop hoping to be seen. You start becoming, not for attention, not for recognition, but because something inside you refuses to stay small. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes your blueprint. The silence that once haunted you becomes your teacher. The solitude that once scared you becomes your home. And when that shift happens, you no longer need to broadcast your wounds. You just carry them differently, not as a burden, but as proof that you kept going. So maybe being overlooked wasn't the tragedy you thought it was. Maybe it was the beginning, the slow, quiet death of illusion, and the birth of something real, something solid, something that no longer seeks validation because it's too busy building something permanent. You don't need to be seen to become something great. You need to see yourself clearly, honestly, without decoration. That's where everything changes. That's where your real life begins. When no one listens, something unexpected happens. You start listening to yourself. Not the surface voice, the one that echoes what others expect from you, but the quieter one underneath. The one you've ignored because it wasn't loud enough to compete with the noise of the world. But in the absence of applause, silence grows roots. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly, not as background noise, but as guidance. It's strange at first, uncomfortable even. You're used to checking your reflection in the eyes of others. But when those eyes turn away, you learn to see yourself from the inside. And that's when something shifts. You begin to move differently, not because someone told you to, not because someone believed in you, but because you decided to show up, without witnesses, without cheerleaders, without someone holding the door open. Self-reliance doesn't arrive in a burst of confidence. It arrives slowly, often disguised as loneliness. You wake up one day and realize no one's checking in, no one's asking how you're doing. And instead of falling apart, you start building. You begin taking yourself seriously, not because others do, but because you've grown tired of waiting. How many times have you paused your growth hoping someone would give you permission to continue? Hoping they'd say it's the right time, the right move, the right direction. But what if that permission never comes? What if no one ever says you're ready? Would you stay frozen forever? Or would you finally claim the authority that was always yours? That's where real power begins, not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. The world teaches us to seek validation like it's oxygen, but the Stoics knew that peace isn't found in popularity, it's found in discipline. Epictetus said, "No person is free who is not master of themselves." Freedom doesn't come from being supported. It comes from knowing that even when you aren't, you will continue. That even when the room is empty, you'll do the work anyway. and not out of bitterness, but because the work matters, because you matter. When you understand that, showing up stops being a performance. It becomes an act of self-respect. And in that quiet, a new relationship forms, not with the world, but with your own mind. You begin to trust it more. You ask it what it needs. You listen to the fatigue in your body, the pull in your gut, the fire behind your chest. You stop outsourcing your intuition. You stop living reactively. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." That awakening doesn't feel like a dramatic breakthrough. It feels like subtle, consistent decisions that build a foundation under your feet. You start keeping your promises to yourself. You go for the walk. You write the words. You say no when something drains you. These aren't loud acts, but they build something no one can see from the outside. Trust. And trust in yourself is the currency of freedom. There's a quiet kind of strength that develops when you realize you are your own backup plan, when the silence doesn't scare you anymore, when you don't need to announce your every move or explain your every feeling, when you don't beg for someone to notice that you're trying, because you know the effort you're making, you know the storms you've walked through, you know what it took to still be here, choosing growth instead of collapse. That's not arrogance. That's integrity. You're no longer performing for the world. You're becoming for yourself. There will still be moments of doubt, moments when you wish someone would say, "I see you." But now you don't depend on it. You no longer fall apart in its absence. You carry yourself with the quiet awareness that you've earned your own respect. And that's rare. That's what makes people pause when you enter a room, not because you demanded attention, but because your energy says, "I don't need it." Seneca once wrote, "The greatest empire is to rule oneself." And ruling yourself doesn't look like perfection. It looks like consistency in the face of invisibility. It looks like doing what matters even when no one applauds. It looks like holding your standards high, even when no one is watching. When you build from that place, you're no longer dependent on external structure. You become the structure. You don't collapse when someone pulls away. You don't unravel when someone misunderstands you, because your foundation was never built on their understanding in the first place. It was built on clarity, on quiet decisions made in solitude, on the strength of waking up and moving forward again and again, because that's who you've chosen to become. And this is the most important part. Once you begin to rely on yourself in this way, you stop resenting others for not being who you needed. You release them. You stop waiting for them to return, to notice, to explain. You no longer tie your progress to their presence. You move regardless, not with coldness, but with grace. You become free, not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer defines the path. You carry it, but it doesn't carry you. That's what true self-reliance looks like. Not an absence of need, but a deep inner steadiness that says, even if no one sees me, even if no one comes, even if no one helps, I will keep going. Because this life is mine to live, and I will not wait for anyone to give me permission to become who I was always meant to be. We live in a world that rewards exposure. Every feeling must be shared, every wound displayed, every moment of struggle turned into something others can comment on. The more visibly broken you are, the more attention you receive. But not all attention is healing. Some of it is hollow. Some of it keeps you dependent on being seen as wounded to feel connected. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to perform your pain. You start editing your suffering, packaging it for sympathy. You turn real emotions into content, thinking it will bring you closer to others. But it doesn't. It just makes your healing public property. What was once sacred becomes consumed. What was once your inner world becomes a storyline for others to follow and forget. There's a difference between honesty and emotional performance. One comes from depth, the other from habit. One is quiet, the other rehearsed, and most of us were never taught the difference. We confuse expression with healing. We think that just because we talk about it, we've worked through it. But sometimes, the more you speak of a wound, the more it stays alive. Not everything needs to be narrated. Some things need to be felt, endured, integrated, in silence. The Stoics weren't emotionless, they were composed. They believed in feeling deeply, but without letting those feelings control the trajectory of their lives. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote, "Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it." He didn't mean suppress emotion. He meant, don't let it become a performance. Let it become presence. We've become conditioned to believe that silence is weakness, that if we don't express every feeling, we're hiding. But some things are not meant to be shared. Some parts of your story are sacred precisely because they belong only to you. Keeping something private doesn't mean you're ashamed. It means you're protecting something precious. And that unnerves people, because silence can't be dissected. It can't be pitied or praised. It demands space. It creates mystery. And mystery, especially in a world addicted to access, feels threatening. Carl Jung spoke often of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we bury or project. But he also said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." The truth is, not every form of healing needs to be visible. Some of the deepest transformations happen when no one is watching, when you're sitting with your thoughts, when you're choosing not to respond, not to prove, not to explain, when you let your emotions pass through without needing them to be seen, liked, or validated. That's not suppression. That's sovereignty. It's easy to mistake the loud for the strong, but strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and still and completely uninterested in being understood. You don't have to prove your growth. You don't have to narrate your healing in real time. You can keep it to yourself and let the results speak later. And that patience, that refusal to perform, is what gives you power, because it means your peace isn't up for public negotiation. There's a kind of beauty in becoming unexplainable, in being someone who no longer shares every emotional bruise just to receive softness in return. You learn that not everyone deserves access to your struggle, not because you're hiding, but because you've stopped offering your pain as a way to earn connection. When you stop broadcasting your wounds, you stop attracting people who are only there to observe the damage, and slowly you begin attracting people who respect what you've built in silence. Seneca said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. But once you've faced adversity and grown from it, you don't need to display the scars to justify your strength. You don't need to keep reopening wounds to remind others of what you've endured. You've proven it to yourself. That's enough. The moment you realize your emotions are not a currency for attention, you stop spending them so carelessly. You start guarding your inner life like something rare, because it is. And in that guarding, you find clarity. You start to realize how much energy was spent explaining what didn't need to be explained. You feel how much power was lost in asking to be understood by people who didn't have the depth to understand themselves. You watch how the crowd celebrates vulnerability, but forgets to mention that real vulnerability isn't exposure. It's discernment. It's knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. It's choosing who gets to see the real you and who only gets the surface. You don't need the world to validate your emotions for them to matter. You don't need to turn your pain into art just to justify why it hurts. You can hold that pain quietly. You can heal without display. You can grieve without an audience. And when you do, something incredible happens. You stop fearing the silence. You begin to feel at home inside it, because it no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like return, a return to yourself, a return to what's real. There's nothing wrong with expressing emotion, but when expression becomes a performance, it robs you of your power. Sovereignty begins the moment you choose presence over performance. The moment you stop explaining yourself to feel safe. The moment you realize your peace isn't fragile, it's forged in solitude. And when others can no longer predict you through your emotional patterns, they start to respect the depth they can't access. Not because you became colder, but because you became wiser. You don't owe anyone a front row seat to your healing, and you don't need to bleed in public to prove you're human. Some things are meant to be held close. Some truths are meant to be whispered only to yourself. That's not hiding. That's maturity. And in a world that glorifies noise, that kind of quiet becomes its own form of rebellion, its own form of freedom. Rejection feels personal because it touches something primal in us, the need to belong, to be seen, to be accepted as we are. But often, what feels like rejection is actually redirection. You weren't dismissed because you lacked value. You were pushed aside because your depth couldn't be digested by shallow eyes. Your silence was mistaken for absence, your self-containment for coldness. You were misunderstood not because you failed to express, but because you carry a frequency most people aren't tuned to. That doesn't make you wrong, it makes you rare. The world, for the most part, doesn't recognize nuance. It celebrates what's easy to label, easy to consume, easy to predict. So when you don't fit into those neat boxes, you become inconvenient. And in a world rushing to categorize, inconvenience is often discarded before it's explored. It's easy to internalize that as a flaw. To think, if I were louder, if I smiled more, if I softened my edges, maybe I'd be accepted. But that's the trap. The belief that your value lies in being legible to others. You weren't made to shrink into their comprehension. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others can easily understand, not who fits the mold, but who you are when no one is watching and you've stopped trying to be approved." That kind of authenticity often comes at the cost of comfort. It invites misunderstanding. It requires solitude. But it also creates space for a deeper kind of transformation, one that isn't driven by applause, but by alignment. There comes a point when you stop interpreting rejection as loss and begin to see it as clarity. Every person who overlooks you, every space that doesn't welcome you, every silence that follows your presence, it all reveals something, not about your worth, but about where your energy doesn't belong. That insight is priceless. It saves you years of self-doubt. It teaches you to invest where you're valued, not just tolerated. And once you learn that, you stop chasing explanations. You stop wondering why someone didn't choose you. You realize that not being chosen was the blessing, because it gave you back to yourself. There's a quiet revolution that begins when you stop trying to be understood. You begin to redirect all the energy you used to spend on being seen into actually building something. Something that doesn't need to be explained. Something that stands on its own. A body of work, a lifestyle, a discipline. You shift from emotional scarcity, constantly trying to prove your worth, to psychological sovereignty, where your existence is no longer up for debate. That's where your center of gravity moves inward. You're not moved by approval or rattled by dismissal. You become grounded. And grounded people are magnetic, not because they seek attention, but because they carry something stable in a world that spins too fast. People will still misread you. They'll create stories to make sense of your quiet, your ambition, your boundaries. Let them. You're not responsible for correcting every false narrative. Marcus Aurelius said, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject." You are the subject. And most people don't know you. Not really. They see glimpses, fragments. They project, assume, simplify. And while that used to bother you, now you see it for what it is, noise. The moment you let go of the need to correct the noise, your focus sharpens. You get more done. You sleep deeper. You move cleaner. Because now your life is no longer built around being perceived correctly. It's built around being lived truthfully. There's immense peace in that. You stop wasting energy explaining your process, your priorities, your silence. You don't justify why you've gone quiet. You don't explain why you walked away. You don't decode your boundaries. You just live them, not as a defense, but as a natural extension of self-respect. You become someone who moves with conviction, not commentary. And over time, that creates distance, not between you and others, but between you and the noise that once clouded your mind. Rejection becomes revelation when you realize it didn't shrink you. It sculpted you. It showed you where not to go, who not to become, what not to settle for. Every door that closed clarified the direction. Every silence refined your voice. Every betrayal deepened your discernment. What once felt like exile now feels like space. Space to build, space to breathe, space to finally become, not someone acceptable, but someone undeniable. And this shift, this movement from wanting to be seen to choosing to become, it changes everything. You stop speaking to be heard and start speaking to build. You stop walking into rooms to prove your worth and start walking into rooms already knowing it. You stop asking if you're too much, too quiet, too intense, and start asking if the space is too small for your truth. You stop apologizing for your depth and start protecting it. That's not arrogance, that's arrival. So, if you've been overlooked, let it be your initiation. If you've been misunderstood, let it be your turning point. You're not here to explain yourself into someone's comfort. You're here to become someone whose presence rewrites the room. And that begins when you finally understand. Rejection isn't the end of your worth. It's the beginning of your clarity. People talk about loneliness as if it's something to escape from, as if the absence of others means the absence of worth. But solitude, when chosen with intention, is not isolation, it's transformation. It doesn't shrink you. It burns away everything that doesn't belong. At first, it feels like silence, a heavy, echoing silence where the noise of the world fades and only your own thoughts remain. But slowly, that silence sharpens. It becomes a mirror that doesn't lie. And what you see there in the absence of distraction is not your weakness, it's your foundation. Solitude doesn't destroy you. It reveals what was always there underneath the noise. The craving for approval, the impulse to please, the subtle performances you didn't even know you were giving. Those things begin to melt away in the furnace of being alone. And in their place, something harder forms, something real. It's in that stillness that you begin to meet yourself honestly, not the version of you curated for others, not the identity shaped by expectation or obligation, but the raw material of your mind, your values, your fears. And for many people, that's exactly why solitude is so terrifying. Because when there's no one left to impress, no one left to chase, you're finally left with the truth. No performance, no edits, just you. And while that might feel like loss at first, it's actually the beginning of freedom. Epictetus wrote, "It's not things that disturb us, but our judgment of them." In solitude, those judgments become visible. You start to realize how many of your thoughts aren't yours, how many of your fears came from someone else's voice, how much of your identity was built on avoiding rejection rather than seeking truth. This is where the internal alchemy begins. The discomfort doesn't disappear, but it transforms. What once felt like loneliness starts to feel like privacy. What once felt like exile begins to feel like clarity. You start hearing your own voice louder than the world's opinions, and that voice, uncensored, unpolished, unafraid, teaches you how to live. You begin to understand that peace isn't found in a full calendar or a full room. Peace is found in presence, in being able to sit with yourself and not flinch, to feel the weight of your own mind and not run from it. That's not detachment, that's mastery. Carl Jung said, "The man who looks outside dreams, the man who looks inside awakens. Solitude is what forces you to look inward, to awaken. And with that awakening comes a kind of responsibility. You can no longer blame the noise for your confusion. You can't blame others for your stagnation. It's just you now. And that's where the power begins. Because the moment you stop externalizing your life, you reclaim the ability to direct it. You're no longer waiting for someone to come save you, validate you, or guide you. You start building your compass from the inside out. And that compass points to something sturdier than attention. It points to integrity. Most people avoid solitude because they don't like what they feel when everything else is stripped away. But that discomfort is exactly what makes the process necessary. You don't become strong by avoiding yourself. You become strong by confronting what's unhealed, unclear, and uncertain, and doing so without an audience. That's the difference between solitude and isolation. Isolation is running away. Solitude is running deeper. And in that deeper place, your resilience is formed. Quietly, consistently, without applause. You begin to make decisions differently, not from a place of, will this be accepted, but from a place of, does this align? You start trusting your instincts more because you've spent time with them. You've listened long enough to separate intuition from insecurity. And that's a level of self-knowledge that can't be taught. It has to be earned. Through silence, through space, through the kind of mental stillness that teaches you how to carry your own weight. That kind of clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. But others feel it. In the way you speak, in the way you move, in the way you don't chase what used to pull you apart. Solitude makes your boundaries sharper. You stop saying yes just to avoid disappointing someone. You stop engaging in conversations that drain your spirit. You learn that no is not unkind, it's honest. And honesty, when cultivated in solitude, becomes a way of living. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to justify your distance or explain your focus. You simply live it. Because you've done the work in silence, and now your energy speaks for itself. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Solitude helps you see the difference. It pulls you out of imagined disasters, false narratives, and inherited fears. It plants you in what's real, and in that soil, something unshakable grows, a sense of self that doesn't shift with trends, a direction that doesn't wobble when misunderstood, a strength that isn't loud, but lasting. When you return to the world after time alone, you come back different. Not distant, but deliberate. Not bitter, but boundaried. You don't speak to be heard. You speak because your words come from stillness, not from noise. You're not easily swayed, not easily shaken, because you know the ground you stand on. You built it yourself, one quiet moment at a time. So no, solitude isn't punishment. It's preparation. It's the training ground for self-trust, self-respect, and self-direction. It's not where life ends. It's where it begins to deepen. And the person who has learned to walk through their own mind, alone and awake, becomes someone the world can't easily move, because they don't belong to the noise anymore. They belong to themselves. There comes a quiet turning point in every life, where the version of you that once felt essential begins to fall apart. Not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow, undeniable erosion. The old self, the one who needed approval, who bent to fit into spaces too small, who rehearsed words just to be liked, that self begins to feel heavy, outdated, false. You try to carry it a little longer, out of habit, out of fear, maybe even out of guilt. But it drags, it stiffens, and eventually it begins to rot. That's not failure, that's evolution. When something dies within you, it isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's the first breath of something deeper, the start of a more honest existence. At first, it's disorienting. You don't feel quite like yourself anymore, but you also can't go back. The mask doesn't fit. The old patterns feel exhausting. You say less, but what you say carries more weight. You stop explaining, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel the need to be understood by everyone. The chase for approval fades, and in its place, something steady begins to grow. You move with more intent. You don't fill silence out of nervousness. You don't perform your personality to make people more comfortable. You simply stand, like a mountain, still, watchful, unmoved. It's strange how people respond when this shift happens. Some distance themselves, others question what changed. They'll say you seem colder, more distant, less fun. What they're really sensing is that you've stopped making yourself available for emotional labor you never consented to in the first place. You've withdrawn from the game of constant reassurance, of being overly palatable. You're no longer addicted to being liked, and that absence makes people uncomfortable, because now they can no longer predict you, and unpredictability in someone who once conformed feels threatening to those still clinging to old versions of who you were. But here's what they don't see. That version of you needed to go. It needed to fall away so you could finally move freely, so you could stop editing your truth to fit someone else's narrative. Carl Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. You didn't kill your old self out of hatred. You outgrew it out of truth. You stopped condemning your need for space, your desire for solitude, your craving for a simpler, quieter strength. And in that acceptance, the old self was released, not as a punishment, but as a rite of passage. You don't need to explain this process to others. The people who truly understand won't ask. And those who don't were never meant to walk with this next version of you anyway. You start to notice who respects your silence and who only knew you for your noise. You realize who valued your essence and who only loved your accessibility. That clarity is painful but necessary. It separates the seasonal from the lifelong. It refines your circle. It clears the emotional clutter you were too polite to discard, and it makes space for alignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That's what the disappearance of your old self is. It feels like a loss, but it opens a path where you no longer chase connection, but attract it by being grounded. A path where you don't need to be known by many to feel known within yourself. You don't seek mirrors in others anymore. You've found your own reflection, and it's enough. There's something sacred about becoming someone who no longer needs to announce their change. You don't post about it. You don't campaign for recognition. You just live differently, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. People feel it in your energy, your decisions, your detachment from petty dramas. They sense a calmness in you that can't be faked, because it came at a cost. It was earned in the quiet dismantling of your former self. In the nights you doubted everything and still chose to continue. In the moments where you wanted to explain, but chose instead to evolve. You're no longer triggered by the same things. You're no longer drawn to the same conversations. You no longer feel the pull to be constantly available. And at first, that feels like loneliness. but then it becomes something else. Freedom, because you realize you were never really connected to those people, those places, or those roles. You were connected to who you had to become in order to stay there. And now that person is gone. Seneca said, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." This isn't just a shift in mindset, it's a rebirth. And like all rebirths, it's quiet at first, underrated, uncelebrated, but incredibly real. And with time, it becomes undeniable, not because you announce it, but because you embody it. You become someone who moves with quiet authority, who doesn't need to explain their values because they live them. Someone whose absence speaks just as loudly as their presence used to. Not out of pride, but out of peace. The old self was necessary. It got you here. It learned the hard lessons, absorbed the wounds, fought for belonging. But its time is over. You don't owe it anything except gratitude and release. And now, in its place, you stand clearer, stronger, unapologetically you. No longer looking back for validation, no longer reaching forward in desperation, but grounded, here, now, whole. And that, more than anything, is what makes you impossible to categorize. Because you've stopped being what the world told you to be. You've become who you were always meant to be. True presence doesn't come from how much you say or how loudly you say it. It comes from how little you need to say. There's a kind of quiet power in someone who has stopped seeking validation, a kind of weight in their stillness. You feel it when they walk into a room and don't try to control the space. They simply are. They don't need to announce their presence because their energy carries it for them. They don't push to be noticed, yet they're the one people watch. It's not arrogance, it's not performance. It's the confidence of someone who's no longer hungry for permission to exist. In a world obsessed with appearances, that kind of restraint is rare. And because it's rare, it's magnetic. You begin to realize that real strength is quiet, not hidden, but uninterested in performance. It's the product of someone who has met their fear and sat with it. Someone who has walked through pain without turning it into a show. Someone who doesn't need to posture or puff up because they're not operating from a place of insecurity. They've already faced the abyss and came back without needing to prove anything to anyone. Carl Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." When you've done that kind of internal work, it changes how you move, it changes how you speak, or how often you choose not to. Because now, silence becomes a statement. You stop reacting to every opinion. You stop defending your every move. You let go of the compulsion to clarify yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, not out of apathy, but out of alignment. You understand now that if someone doesn't feel your value, no amount of words will make them see it. And if someone does feel your value, you won't have to convince them. So you conserve your energy. You speak only when it matters. And when you do speak, people listen. Not because you're louder, but because you're selective. Your words weren't scattered. They were earned. They weren't about being heard. They were about expressing something real, something rooted. There's a power in that detachment. Not the cold kind that pushes people away, but the self-contained kind that doesn't cling to outcomes. When you no longer rely on people to affirm your worth, you free them from the responsibility of carrying your identity, and you free yourself from the constant tug of needing to be liked, validated, or praised. That freedom makes you light, but it also makes you heavy in the eyes of others, because now your self-possession is something they can feel, and it unsettles people who are still measuring themselves through the eyes of others. Because when they meet someone who doesn't need the crowd, they're forced to face the fact that they might still be living for it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one that's the essence of commanding without words. You don't try to be impressive. You just embody what you value. And the irony is, when you stop trying to be impressive, you often become unforgettable. Not because you shouted, but because your silence had depth, because your stillness had direction, because you weren't trying to win the room. You were rooted in something deeper than performance. People mistake detachment for disinterest, but true detachment is the highest form of clarity. It means you can engage without being absorbed. You can be present without being performative. You can care without clinging. And that clarity speaks louder than charisma. Because when someone can't be shaken by judgment, can't be baited into overreacting, can't be swayed by flattery or criticism, they start to feel like an immovable force. And we don't just respect forces, we adjust ourselves around them. This is what sets apart the grounded from the attention-hungry. The grounded don't compete for the spotlight because they carry their own light. They're not chasing the next compliment or performance-based connection. They're building something quiet but lasting, something that doesn't crumble when the room goes silent, something that doesn't shift with public opinion. And people notice. They always do. Because in a culture that rewards the loud, the steady become mysterious. The ones who don't need to prove themselves start to feel like they've already proven something far more important: self-mastery. There's no need to chase recognition when you move with intention. No need to explain your pace when you trust your timing. The less you say, the more room others have to feel what you are. And when your presence is built on depth, not performance, it leaves an imprint. Not because it was loud, but because it was grounded. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Quiet power is built on that principle. You decide who you are, and then you live it. Not for applause, but for alignment. So if you've ever wondered why certain people command attention without asking for it, this is why. They don't chase it. They don't ask for it. They simply move in alignment with who they are. And that kind of presence, grounded in inner stillness, always speaks louder than noise. It doesn't need to shout. It just is. There's a strange kind of freedom that arrives the moment you stop needing care. Not because you've become bitter or numb, but because you've finally outgrown the illusion that your strength should depend on how others treat you. It's the point where a subtle but permanent shift happens inside. The world no longer has the same power to shake you. Its silence doesn't unsettle you. Its applause doesn't seduce you. You begin to move from a different place, from a center that doesn't ask for permission, doesn't beg to be seen, and doesn't fall apart when it's ignored. That's the paradox. You only gain real power when you stop needing to be rescued, not from pain, but from the discomfort of being alone in your truth. For a long time, we're taught to believe that care from others equals safety, that we must be heard to feel real, understood to feel valid, held to feel whole. But there's a deeper truth underneath all of that. The truth that power isn't something given to you by attention, love, or recognition. It's something built in silence, brick by brick, with the choices you make when no one's watching. That's why once you stop craving the emotional resources of others, something remarkable happens. You start becoming your own source. And when you do, you realize you were never powerless. You were just waiting for permission to be strong. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's where this new form of power begins, with acceptance. Not just of your strengths, but your fears, your darkness, your disappointment, your unmet needs. You accept that maybe they won't ever understand you, that maybe no one will love you exactly the way you've always wanted. And rather than fight it, you exhale. You stop resisting what is. You stop trying to control how others feel about you. And in that surrender, a new kind of control emerges. not over people or outcomes, but over yourself. You stop explaining things that don't need to be explained. You stop handing out pieces of your soul in exchange for temporary comfort. You no longer make yourself smaller to be digestible. You no longer bend your voice to avoid tension. You simply stand in your life, unfolded, unedited, and let the chips fall where they may. Some people will fall away, some will come closer, but none of that changes who you are, because now you are the one who defines your worth. You've stopped outsourcing it. You've stopped chasing love as proof of existence, and because of that, you're no longer fragile. You're rooted. It doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you wall yourself off or walk through life untouched. It means you stop expecting external care to fix what only internal clarity can. You stop making your healing a group project. You understand now that peace is built alone, and it's maintained by protecting that solitude, not by constantly inviting others into it to validate your progress. You no longer need to be mirrored in someone else's eyes to know you're whole. The mirror is now internal, and it doesn't distort. You also stop fearing disconnection, because the deepest connection, the one with yourself, has already been established. That's what makes you strong, not cold, not distant, but self-contained. People can come and go. You can love and be loved, but your foundation doesn't shake with their presence or their withdrawal. That's not detachment from life. It's engagement on your own terms. And that's what true autonomy looks like. You stop being a guest in your own mind. You become the architect. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. When your attention is no longer hooked by who notices you, who cares, who claps, or who stays, you redirect that energy inward, not in isolation, but in intention. You start asking different questions, not, why did they treat me that way, but what can I build with what's left? You start turning your pain into discipline, your silence into strategy, your disappointments into design, because you're not stuck anymore. You're not frozen waiting for the next wave of validation to carry you forward. You've become the current. This kind of power, this grounded, quiet, untouchable strength, it's not something that's handed to you by good fortune or the right people. It's forged in the moment you stop needing others to meet you, and instead meet yourself where you are. And from that meeting place, something more honest rises. A self that's no longer edited to please. A direction that's no longer influenced by fear of being misunderstood. A life that's finally yours, not borrowed from others' expectations, but owned. You become someone who moves with clarity, not desperation. Someone who can hold space for their own emotions without leaking them into every interaction. Someone who doesn't crumble when the applause stops because you never built your rhythm around their noise. You don't need to be followed to feel like you're going somewhere. You know where you're going. And that's why people start to feel your gravity, not because you demand it, but because you no longer need it. And that's rare. So when you stop needing care,